The sound of the door slamming echoed through Maggie's soul long after the wall stopped shaking. His words, cold, sharp, and final, still hung in the air like smoke. "You disgust me." She had replayed them in her mind 100 times, each repetition cutting deeper until her tears no longer came. The man who once held her like she was fragile glass had turned into a stranger overnight. His eyes that once softened at her laughter now burned with something cruel and distant. Lucas Grayson, the man the world called brilliant, successful, untouchable, had just crushed the only person who loved him without condition. Maggie stood frozen, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of the marble counter as if it could keep her standing. The silence of the apartment was unbearable. It seemed to mock her pain. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, a ghost that refused to leave. Her world, once bright and full of promises, felt smaller now, suffocating. She had spent years believing in him, believing that behind the armor of his success there was a man who could feel. But in that moment, she saw what he truly valued: power, pride, control, and love had no place in it. When the tears finally came, they weren't delicate. They were raw, unstoppable, full of every broken dream she had nurtured. Maggie sank to the floor, clutching her stomach protectively as if shielding her unborn child from the cruelty that had just shattered her world. She whispered through sobs, "I'll protect you. I'll never let you feel unwanted." The city lights flickered through the window like cold stars, and for the first time, she realized she couldn't stay. Everything here belonged to him. Every piece of furniture, every memory, every breath of air. She had to leave before she forgot who she was. Hours later, as dawn painted the skyline in soft gold, Maggie packed her bag in silence. No jewelry, no dresses, no reminders of the man who had destroyed her spirit. Only the ultrasound photo tucked safely in her pocket. She didn't look back as she closed the door behind her. Somewhere beyond the city, there had to be a place where she could begin again. Somewhere her child could grow without the shadow of Lucas Grayson's voice haunting every heartbeat. What she didn't know was that 4 years later, fate would bring him back to that promise. Only this time, he would be the one broken, and she would be the one who walked away. The bus rattled softly as it rolled through the rain-washed countryside. Maggie pressed her forehead to the cold window, watching the city she once called home disappear behind her like a bad dream she could finally wake from. Her reflection stared back at her. Tired eyes, messy hair, a woman who had lost everything but refused to break. She placed a trembling hand on her stomach, whispering softly, "It's just you and me now." The words steadied her heart. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. When the bus stopped in a quiet little town, the air smelled of pine and bread. She didn't plan to stay, but something about the silence felt safe. No skyscrapers, no paparazzi, no whispers of Lucas Grayson. Just small houses, kind faces, and streets where no one knew her name. She found a small room above a bakery whose owner didn't ask questions, and that night she slept without crying. The scent of fresh bread drifted through her dreams, reminding her that new beginnings rarely looked grand. They were simple, quiet, and necessary. Days turned into weeks. Maggie found work at a cozy bookstore owned by an elderly woman named Ruth, who believed in second chances. She earned little, but enough to live. and each day she felt her strength return piece by piece. During her lunch breaks, she read parenting books, learning how to raise a child alone. One afternoon, while lying on the doctor's table during a checkup, she heard the heartbeat, fast, steady, full of life. Then another one followed. The doctor smiled gently. "Twins," he said. For a moment, Maggie couldn't breathe. 2 heartbeats, 2 lives, 2 reasons to fight. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she laughed and cried all at once. "You were meant to find me," she whispered. The fear that had lived inside her for so long began to fade, replaced by something new. Courage. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something from the ashes of what he destroyed. And somewhere in his glass tower, Lucas Grayson sat in a meeting, unaware that the greatest part of his life had just begun without him. Winter arrived early that year, brushing frost over the bakery windows and painting Maggie's mornings in silver. She woke before sunrise each day, her body heavier, her steps slower, yet her heart stronger than ever. The town had quietly become her shelter, a place where no one cared about the name Lucas Grayson or the empire he ruled. People here knew her as the kind girl at the bookstore, who always smiled, even when her eyes looked tired. They didn't know her past, and she preferred it that way. She was no longer the woman who had begged to be loved. She was the woman preparing to give love unconditionally. Her pregnancy grew more difficult with each passing week. Nights were sleepless, her back ached, and sometimes she would wake in fear, hearing echoes of his voice from her dreams. But then a small flutter inside her reminded her of the life she carried, 2 tiny heartbeats that had given her purpose again. She would sit by the window, hands resting on her belly, whispering softly, "I'm here, and I'll never leave you." Each word felt like a vow stitched into her soul. When the contractions came one cold night, it was too soon. Panic gripped her as pain rippled through her body. She tried to call for help, but her voice barely escaped her lips. The ambulance lights flashed outside, turning the walls of her small room into a blur of red and white. Hours later, she opened her eyes to the sterile brightness of a hospital room. Her body was weak, her mind foggy, but the sound of 2 tiny cries pulled her back to life. Her twins, Ava and Caleb, were born too early, too fragile, but they were alive. The next few weeks passed in slow, aching moments inside the NICU. Machines beeped around her like a symphony of survival. She sat by their incubators every day, reading to them, singing lullabies and whispering stories of hope. The nurses began to call her the fighter. They said she had a calm strength, but they didn't see the nights she cried quietly in the hospital bathroom, begging the universe to let her children live. When Ava opened her eyes for the first time, and Caleb's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, Maggie smiled through tears. She knew she had lost everything once, but sitting there, holding the future in her hands, she realized she had gained something far greater. And though she didn't know it yet, the world that had once broken her was about to come knocking again. Snow blanketed the small town like a secret the world had forgotten to uncover. Maggie stood by the window of her little apartment above the bakery, cradling Ava and Caleb in her arms. Their soft breaths and tiny hands reminded her that miracles sometimes came in pairs. Life had become a careful rhythm of feedings, lullabies, and long nights where exhaustion blurred into love. Each cry, each small smile from her babies stitched her heart stronger. She was no longer the woman Lucas had destroyed. She was someone entirely new. Quietly powerful, fiercely devoted, and unafraid of tomorrow. Days melted into months, and though her body ached and her eyes carried permanent shadows, her spirit glowed. She returned to work part-time at the bookstore, carrying the twins in their stroller, their laughter filling the air like music. Customers adored them, and Ruth, the kind old owner, often slipped extra bills into Maggie's pay envelope with a wink. "You're doing beautifully, dear," she'd whisper. Maggie would smile, though part of her still trembled at night, wondering if the past could ever truly stay buried. Meanwhile, in the city far away, Lucas Grayson's empire began to shift. His success no longer satisfied him. Late nights at the office stretched into early mornings, his penthouse echoing with silence. He had everything: power, money, fame. But there was an emptiness inside him that meetings couldn't fill. He'd begun noticing the small things: the empty chair at his dinner table, the untouched piano she once played, the faint perfume that never truly faded from his memory. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue. But deep down, something haunted him. A face he had driven away with cruel words, and a heart he had thrown aside without mercy. Back in the quiet town, Maggie rocked Ava and Caleb to sleep, whispering a promise that had guided her through every storm. "You will never need what I lost," she said softly. But as she gazed at their blue eyes, so identical to his, it was impossible to forget. The past still lived in their faces, and fate has a way of circling back. She didn't know that across the city skyline, Lucas Grayson had just received an anonymous letter. Inside was a photograph. 2 children with his eyes and her smile. And for the first time in 4 years, the man who thought he couldn't feel couldn't stop trembling. Lucas sat frozen in his office, the photograph trembling in his hand. 2 children. A boy and a girl, their smiles soft, their eyes, his eyes, staring back at him with innocence he did not deserve. The world outside his glass tower blurred into nothing. For years, he had believed success was the cure for his emptiness, that money could drown guilt, and work could silence regret. But that picture, those faces, ripped open everything he had buried. His chest tightened until breathing hurt. "This can't be real," he whispered, but deep down he knew. Somewhere in a quiet corner of the world, Maggie had built the life he destroyed, and he had missed every heartbeat of it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The memory of her leaving, her tears, his cruel words, every moment replayed like a punishment. He remembered the look in her eyes when he had said, "You disgust me." And now he realized who the real monster had been. The guilt clawed at him until dawn broke through his penthouse windows. By morning, he had made a decision. He would find her, not to reclaim what he lost, but to face what he had done. Maggie, unaware of the storm heading her way, had just dropped the twins off at the small daycare across from the bakery. Life had finally found rhythm again. The bookstore had become her second home, the smell of pages and ink her comfort. Ava loved drawing on the floor beside her, while Caleb played with the toy blocks by the counter. The town adored them. They were symbols of hope. Maggie often looked at them with quiet pride, thinking how far she'd come. She didn't need anyone, especially not the man who once broke her. Her happiness no longer depended on him. It was built from the ground up with her hands, her courage, her love. But fate rarely asks permission. One afternoon, as snow began to fall again, a sleek black car pulled up outside the bookstore. Maggie didn't notice at first. She was shelving books, humming softly. Then the door opened and the air shifted. The voice she hadn't heard in 4 years spoke her name, quiet but trembling. "Maggie!" Her heart stopped. The book slipped from her hand and hit the floor. And when she turned, standing before her was Lucas Grayson, haunted, older, and broken in ways she never thought possible. For a moment, time froze between them. The bookstore fell silent, except for the faint rustle of pages and the snow tapping softly against the windows. Lucas stood there, the man who once ruled everything, now looking small and uncertain. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. 4 years had passed, yet his presence still carried the weight of a storm. His eyes searched hers desperately, but she couldn't find the strength to move. It was as if all the pain she had buried came rushing back at once. "I didn't know," he whispered, voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know about them." Maggie's heart clenched. The children. Of course he knew now. Someone must have told him. But what did it matter? He had made his choice long ago. "It doesn't change anything, Lucas," she said quietly, but her voice trembled. He stepped closer, his expression filled with regret that words could never repair. "Please." "Just let me see them," he pleaded. She wanted to scream, to remind him of the night he slammed the door, the night she swore never to let him hurt them. But before she could respond, 2 small voices called from the doorway. "Mommy?" Ava and Caleb stood there in their little winter coats, eyes wide and curious. Lucas turned, and the world stopped. His heart cracked open. The resemblance was undeniable. His own eyes stared back at him from 2 innocent faces that didn't yet understand what he had done. Tears fell before he could stop them. He knelt, trembling, unable to speak. The weight of 4 lost years crushed him in that single moment. "They're beautiful," he whispered through shaking breath. Maggie stood frozen, torn between anger and pity. The man before her was not the one who had broken her. This was a man stripped of ego, haunted by the cost of his pride. "You don't get to cry now," she said softly, her voice steady but full of sorrow. Lucas nodded, his tears falling silently. "I know, but I will spend the rest of my life proving I'm sorry." For the first time in years, Maggie didn't see the powerful CEO everyone feared. She saw a man who had finally learned what love truly meant, only when it was too late. And though she didn't forgive him, she finally understood. Some heartbreaks are not the end. They're the beginning of becoming someone stronger,